Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the architecture of the mind. And, I want to kick things off by setting up a really high-stakes, real-life medical mystery. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the very fabric of your reality, the basic way you understand the space around you, has just completely, fundamentally changed. Our brains, right, they're not just these uniform blocks of gray tissue. They are incredibly intricate machines. And to truly understand how they work, we kind of have to look at what happens when a single, very specific part of that machine breaks down.
So, what if you suddenly forgot how to navigate your own house? Let me introduce you to a really fascinating story about a guy we're going to call Bob. Now, Bob was brilliant. He was witty, holding down this incredibly high-powered job, really the life of the party. But over the course of a few years, something totally inexplicable started happening to him. He began getting lost in his own hometown, a place he had literally lived in for years. Actually, get this, once when a friend asked him how to drive into the city from his house, Bob confidently told him to go to the end of the driveway and turn left, which was completely wrong. He couldn't even give basic directions from his own driveway. And these little navigational glitches, they just didn't make any sense because Bob was absolutely fine in every other way. Until one morning. He was staying at a friend's house right before a conference. Suddenly, there's this shuffling sound, and then a massive crash. Bob had collapsed on the floor, totally unresponsive. So he's rushed to the ER, and strangely enough, the doctors initially found absolutely zero physical issues. His vitals were normal, his heart was fine. They were actually ready to just send him home. But later that evening, a frantic phone call completely changed everything. Bob called his friend and uttered some truly terrifying words. "Get over here. They found something in my brain."
Now, what's really interesting here is exactly what they found on his brain scan. Sitting smack in the middle of Bob's brain was a tumor literally the size of a lime. And looking back at some older MRI scans from a previous research study that Bob had actually participated in, it was clear this tumor had been growing very slowly from the size of a grape over several years. But here is the most astonishing part of the whole thing. This tumor was perfectly positioned right next to a highly specialized region of the brain known as the parahippocampal place area. Now, this is a region specifically involved in recognizing scenes and navigating spaces. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly specific nature of his problem. The night before Bob underwent major brain surgery to remove this lime-sized tumor, the doctors tested him. When they asked him to just draw a quick sketch map of the floor plan of his house, he produced a totally scattered, disorganized soup of lines. The rooms weren't even aligned. He just couldn't visualize the space at all. But when they gave him a piece of paper and asked him to draw a multi-part object, say a lobster or a bicycle, his drawings were remarkably accurate. Everything was exactly in the right place. So he permanently lost his spatial arrangement for places, but perfectly retained the ability to arrange the individual parts of an object. This brings us to an absolutely crucial concept, brain modularity. Now, Bob survived his massive 11-hour surgery beautifully. Within days, he was right back at work. His IQ was unchanged, his ability to drive was intact, his sense of humor remained exactly the same. But his navigational abilities, they never came back. Without his smartphone GPS, he'd be completely lost. So Bob's story proves that the brain isn't just this big, uniform bunch of mush. It's highly modular. It's like a giant puzzle. A single broken piece doesn't break the whole machine, it just takes out one incredibly specific mental ability. So, moving on to section 1, why study the brain? The ultimate intellectual quest. There are 4 main pillars to consider here. First, to know thyself. Think about it. If you have a bad heart, surgeons can give you a heart transplant, right? You just get a new pump and you're still you. But a brain transplant? That doesn't even make sense because taking someone else's brain would literally make you a totally different person. The brain is your true identity. Second, by studying the mind, we learn the profound limits of human knowledge, what we're actually physically capable of comprehending. Third, to advance artificial intelligence. And fourth, it's just simply the greatest intellectual quest of all time, cracking the code of how physical, biological cells somehow create human consciousness. But, let's circle back to that third point for a minute. Okay, let's dive into this in section 2. Humans versus deep nets, the limits of artificial intelligence. For decades, AI researchers could only dream of matching human vision, but that recently changed in a big way. Back in 2012, a deep learning network called AlexNet
totally revolutionized the field. It was trained on over 1 million images, and its accuracy was just astonishing. It could look at an image containing a tiny mite and correctly identify it as its first choice. It could perfectly spot a massive container ship, and even when it made an error, like calling a close-up picture of a car grille a convertible, it was a completely understandable mistake, right? AI had finally achieved near-human abilities in recognizing highly specific image patterns. But despite all the massive hype, there's a pretty big catch. When scientists test these highly sophisticated AI networks on atypical, real-world images, images where objects are at weird angles or just not perfectly framed like a standard stock photograph, their performance completely plummets. In some recent tests, accuracy dropped from 71% all the way down to roughly 25%. Wow. Humans, on the other hand, we can still easily recognize objects, even if they're upside down, partly hidden, or weirdly lit.
So the crucial point is this. Deep nets are incredibly good at pattern classification. They are great at labeling things like, that's a cat, that's a dog, or that's a toaster. But human minds are fundamentally different. We build rich structural models to actually understand the context of the world. For example, let's say you show an image captioning AI a famous photo of former President Obama secretly stepping on a scale while another politician is being weighed. The AI might perfectly label it a group of people standing next to a man in a suit. Now, the AI is factually correct, but it wildly misses the context. It doesn't understand the joke, it can't infer what the person on the scale believes versus what Obama knows, and it totally misses the human emotion of embarrassment. As neuroscientist Jim DiCarlo pointed out, AI systems can't navigate new situations, infer what others believe, use language to communicate, write poetry and music, or create math. And this is exactly why studying the human brain is so absolutely critical for AI. Because while artificial neural networks are undeniably powerful, they still have a massive amount to learn from the biological architecture inside our own heads if they ever want to move from simply recognizing patterns to actually, truly understanding the world.
Let's move to section 3 and see how this all builds together. Mapping the mind, the uncharted future. This timeline really puts things into perspective for us. Back in the 1800s, scientists discovered language regions by studying patients with brain damage. But fast forward 100 years to 1990, and our map of the brain was still pretty basic, mostly just sensory and motor regions with a few early hints about face recognition. But today, the progress has been absolutely explosive. Thanks largely to functional MRI technology over the last couple of decades, scientists have now mapped dozens of highly specific regions. In every single one of us, we now know exactly where the brain computes places, faces, numbers, and even how we think about other people's minds. It's wild. And scientists, they don't just rely on one trick to figure this out. They use synergistic methods to crack the brain's code. Step 1 starts with cognitive science, simply observing human behavior, testing reaction times, and using perceptual illusions to define what the mind can actually do. Step 2 is neuropsychology, which takes us right back to Bob's story, right? Studying patients with brain damage to see exactly which mental functions are preserved and which are lost. And finally, step 3 is neuroimaging, using high-tech machines like fMRI and EEG to look right into the living brain and see exactly which regions light up when we perform specific tasks. But even with all this incredible high-tech mapping, we are literally just scratching the surface here. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you staring at the profound, uncharted, and ongoing mysteries of your very own mind. Think about this. Can we truly think without language? And how much is happening down there in the dark basement of our brains entirely without our conscious awareness? The answers to these questions are still being mapped out as we speak. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.